Honor and a privilege for me to present this. I have practiced gardening for many years, since actually the early 70s. A friend of mine, Sue, when I was in grad school days, got me interested in gardening, and I've been hooked ever since. I only hope you enjoy as much as I do of gardening. It's just a fun thing. And of course, it has some really good benefits. Um, the focus of the presentation today and the seed starting seminar will be on growing things, starting seeds indoors. It will cover outdoor seeds, but the focus, because that's where most of the effort will be, if you try to grow seeds, growing them indoors is far more complex than just putting them right in the soil in your garden. Um, the overall view of what's going to be covered today will be, basically what your options are for growing a garden, uh, seeds, starting them, etc. How do you want to, get your plants in, buying plants, and if you go with starting your seeds, what are the requirements for getting the seeds to germinate? What are you going to need? And then if you grow them, again, these are indoors, uh, the next step after you get them germinated and up and growing is to pot them, repot them into bigger pots ready to be put outside, and then hardening off these plants that are now very tender, and then finally transplanting the plants into your garden itself. Um, if you look at your options for planting a garden, you could go out and buy plants at a big box store or order them online, or you could direct seed, even plants that are could be grown indoors. You could direct seed, just have to wait longer, or you can start the seedlings indoors. And again, that's the focus of what we're talking today. Now, if you bought your plants, of course, it's the least effort. It's easy. You just go out and spend money. It is definitely the most expensive of the options, I think, and it will allow you to get fruit the soonest. But the downside is you'll have very limited selection. You have to get what's there if you go to a big box store. Um, and it might be your best choice for something like a perennial, because it's complicated to grow them. But for the most part, it's going to be, to me, better if you start from a seed. You have more options as far as more selection for what you could grow, the varieties that you can grow. And if you direct seed, it's fairly minimal effort and minimal expense. You don't have to have any seed growing equipment or anything of that nature. You're just putting them directly in the ground. And so from that standpoint, it is probably the easiest way to go, especially for a beginning gardener. However, and it is definitely better for certain crops, and I'll talk about them in just a minute, root crops, et cetera. But the downside of putting directly in the garden, seeds directly in the garden and trying to germinate them there, is that not only is it difficult, but it also, you have to wait until the conditions, the soil temperature, et cetera, are optimal for germinating. So it's going to be the longest time to get fruit. Starting seeds indoors, to me, is um, uh, probably the direction that I went early on, because of the advantages. It is the greatest effort, and it has some expenses involved to get equipment. Uh, but once you get that equipment, you can use it year after year. Um, and it's kind of in between. It's not the shortest if you buy plants directly, but it's a lot longer than waiting and till the soil conditions are right to plant in the garden itself. And again, you get the more selection available because you're buying seeds. Uh, in my opinion, it's probably your best option for most seeds, most plants. Now, some crops are definitely better planted directly into the garden. Uh, Among these are root crops, beets, radish, carrots, greens, lettuce, spinach, uh, and among them are large seeded plants and, beans, corn, squash, etc. These seeds, uh, are easy to germinate in the soil, and you really can't plant them any sooner than the soil conditions are require them to grow in the garden. So putting them inside, starting them inside, is just not the optimum for them. Uh, uh, it's also cool weather plants, seeds like English peas, lettuce, radish. These are really easier to plant outside than to try to put inside, because the soil the soil is ready early, so you can put them in. And there are a few plants that are kind of unique that are just hard to transplant, and among these are okra. Uh, so yeah, for the most part, there are a number of seeds that you should probably be planting directly, but most of the seeds are really best planted indoors. Start early, and you'll get an early jump on getting the fruit. Um, what's it take to have success? And this applies to both direct planting and planting indoors. Is the number one thing is you have good quality seeds, and we'll talk about each of these items as we go down in the presentation. You need growing media to start with the seeds, and then to transplant them into smaller pots ready to be put in the garden. You need water, you need air, you need proper temperatures for the plants to germinate and to grow. Uh, Lighting is another very, very important aspect to growing indoors. Uh, and some plants require some special conditions. We'll talk about them. And timing is another very important issue. You want to time your starting seeds indoors to coincide so that they're ready to be put outside at the proper time. The soil conditions are proper for them to grow. If you start too early, the soil will be too cold in the garden, and you'll get plants that are really too big for the pots you put them in. If you start too late, you've lost some valuable time. Fertilization is another factor, and big picture planning and organization. I kind of lump a whole bunch of things into that. So those are the items that we're going to be talking about the balance of the presentation. Let me start with what are seeds. Seeds are basically three parts. There's an embryonic plant in the seed, there's stored food, and a protective coat that maintains the seed's integrity and helps it stay in a state of, if you would, hibernation. Seeds are kind of like a hot ember that comes off a fire. If you've ever started an outdoor fire, the embers may fly off and go somewhere. And when they do, if the ember is hot enough and the conditions are right, it can actually start a fire somewhere else. But if the conditions that are not right, or they will stop burning, and you won't get a fire elsewhere. Seeds are a living ember, if you would. And if you keep that in mind in storing the seeds and growing them, they're something that is miraculous, if you would. But our job as a gardener is to try to coax the plant that's in that seed to grow and bear fruit. Now, one of the first and most important things about selecting seeds is, you when you plant your garden, you want to say, well, there's hundreds of seeds in the store. Which one do I want to buy? Well, you know what you like to eat and what you enjoy eating. Those are the seeds I would focus on. Buy seeds you like to eat, that for plants that you like to eat. For me, another factor it plays in is if I see something that's really cheap to buy, that's easy in a store, I'd be less inclined to plant it in my garden. So I put things in my garden that are typically expensive or maybe difficult to find in the store. Uh, Another thing is if you put in plants that
Thai basil.
you enjoy the fresh flavor you might not get at a store bought. Buying them in a store, like the taste of sun ripened tomatoes. It's hard to find that in the store. So if you grow those kinds of plants, you can get them right out of your garden. Just walk outside and pick that delicious flavored fruit. And uh, another thing that you factor that you should uh, use to select your plants are ease of growth. If it's hard to grow a plant, you might try it the first year, but it's easier to stick with things that are easy to grow. So those are the type of seeds that I pick when I go to a store, and that's the factors I use. Um, Seeds are probably the single most important ingredient for success in a garden. Um, if you select bad seeds, those that have been improperly stored or they just have low germination rates, you basically are wasting your time and your effort to try to get them to germinate. So it's always a good idea to buy fresh seeds from reputable seed suppliers. Uh, and if you save seeds from the previous in the packets for more than 1 year, and they will last if properly stored, um, you can check to see if they're still viable by performing a germination test. And this might be a good idea for those kinds of seeds, especially if you suspect that they may have lower germination rates and been stored too long or maybe not in the right conditions. Uh, One thing that I'll note is often people save seeds from their crop, not a packet, but from their crop, like beans or like peppers, and that will work. But it's possible, especially if you have hybrids, that you might have seeds that aren't true. So if, for example, you have peppers and you save the seeds from the pepper fruit, the peppers that you plant from those seeds may not be the type of plants you want to see in your garden. They may have some different flavors or completely different from the parents that bore the seeds. So be careful about replanting seeds. There's a seminar on this that's given in our county. I think Josh has presented about saving seeds, and you probably can learn more about it in that presentation, or just by doing more research yourself. Shopping for seeds. Best to shop early, and you get the best selection. At this point in time, end of January, it's especially this year because of COVID, it's the supply is very limited. Some seed suppliers are pretty much out of whatever you might want, the most popular seeds. So, you can still buy them perhaps, but it may be limited selection from what you maybe originally could have had. So, but you can buy seeds online or locally. I just walked in a local big box store and I noticed that they had put their seeds out. And of course, that's it's a magnetic attraction to me to go take a look at them. And they did have a lot of variety. So might not be too late. But one thing that if I do buy in a store, a local big box store, is I look for where they put their seed packets. I've seen stores that have put their packets in very humid conditions, and that's not going to be good for your seeds this year, or if you save them to future years, it's going to cause the germination rates to drop. So I'm always careful about where I buy when I buy in a big box store. When you buy the packets, you'll see plenty times, hopefully, some descriptions of the seeds or the plants or the fruit. And often you'll see an alphabet soup. I call it alphabet soup, a series of letters or whatever. You can, these really describe the disease resistance for the plants. So it's always a good idea to find plants that are resistant to diseases. If it's your first year, you probably won't have too many diseases. But if you replant in the same locale, eventually diseases will catch up with you. And so it's more important to look at the disease resistance for the plants. Also, some seeds come in pelletized form. The pellets are really kind of a clay coating. It definitely makes it easier to handle and will improve the germination if you buy the pelleted seed. But the downside is you won't get as many seeds. So anyways, these are factors to consider shopping for seeds. And we talked a little bit about the germination test. If you're using a packet that you'd saved from the previous year or previous years, I often keep my seeds, some of them as long as 5 years, because I store them in the proper conditions: cool, dry, cool, and dark. Those are the factors. Dry is most important, cool, and dark. What you can do to perform this test is it's very simple. You put a fixed number of seeds, and I pick typically 10 because it makes it easy to calculate percentages. 10 seeds in a wet paper towel, and then put that paper towel in a plastic bag, label it, and wait and keep checking it every few days for germination, allowing sufficient time for the germination to occur. There's every seed's a little different. So I provided here a chart of how long it takes for seeds to germinate. Also, this chart provides the optimum and minimum and max temperatures to germinate the seed. But for example, if you planted, I'm looking for a good one, an eggplant seed, shows 6 days should take to germinate. So, if you waited 10 days and nothing came out of the seeds, then you got some bad seeds. So hopefully, and when you look at your seeds and you simply count the number of seeds that germinated and divide it by the number of seeds you put in, that tells you your germination rate. So this chart is useful also for outdoor gardening, because it tells you for some plants what the temperatures are that they would germinate. For example, lima beans here, the first one, the minimum temperature is 60 degrees. Optimum is 85. So you really don't want to plant lima beans any sooner than the temperature of the soil is 60 degrees. And these others, you can see cabbage now, that's a cool weather plant. And so it's a lot lower, 40 degrees. So you can plant cabbage much sooner in your garden and get your produce and not lose the plant. Planting too soon, the seeds may just rot in the ground simply because the temperatures are not right for the seed to germinate. So anyways, that point, I think, is this a useful chart. You can find, I put a reference on this chart, but you can find this if you search for germination vegetable seeds on the internet. You can find similar charts. And there may be some variability from site to site, but you'll get the general idea. I think UGA might have some information like this too. So now we purchased our seeds and we want to plant them. So the next aspect is to select your growing media. The media for the seed starting should be sterile, free of diseases, other foreign seeds, algae, or anything of that nature. It should be light in texture. This allows for air and water pockets. And typically this stuff is made out of, if you buy it, perlite. It contains perlite and vermiculite and with sharp sand. You can buy this stuff commercially, or you can make it yourself. Quite honestly, the commercial mixes, like here I show Miracle Grow seed starting mix. It's really your best bet, in my opinion. I think it's just easier and it's safer. I provide the next slide here provides a homemade recipe, but I'll tell you, the materials you put in to the seed starting are not really healthy for you to breathe. Perlite, vermiculite, they can go airborne when they're dry. And if you do this, you should wear a mask. And really, to me, it's just hardly worth the effort to do this at home when it's really easier and I don't know about cheaper, but it's just safer, if you ask me, to start your seeds with the purchased commercial growing media. Just my thought. So now we have our seeds and we have our growing media selected. Well, I'm not sure I covered. No, I'm not sure I covered one other. Well, I think we'll cover it later, and that's the containers we're growing. I guess I put them in the category containers. You want to sanitize whatever container you use. And you can use a 10% bleach solution, soaking those containers for 30 minutes. The idea here is to kill any diseases or algae on the containers themselves. If you buy them from the store, you're probably safe without having to go through this step. But if you reuse them like I do, you definitely want to sterilize them. There's different kinds of containers. There's trays that have individually separated seeds, pots. There's some without dividers. That's what I do. There's some pressed peat moss pucks you probably see, and anything else that allows for drainage and easy watering will work. Some people might even use a recycle container. It's got to have a drainage. That's the main thing. Also, if you buy a container, typically there's these plastic domes or covers. They're good early on when you're starting the seeds, getting them to germinate, because it holds the moisture in, something you really want to do when you start the seeds. But if you leave them on past the germination stage, after they start emerging, it actually encourages algae. So, use it only early on. I guess if you want to use larger pots, it's okay. Using the smaller pots, you'll have to repot. But to me, it's the way I do it. I think it's better from the standpoint of you want to use pots kind of commensurate with the seed, with the plant. Too large a pot, you get algae on the edge and you start having problems. The next item of importance in growing seeds, starting them, is water. And for a soilless mix, let's say you've made it or you bought it, what I typically do is I take the mix and I put it in a container and I wet it with warm water and then massage the material with the water until it's thoroughly damp, and then hand squeeze out the excess moisture. Put the material in the plastic containers, seed containers, and then firm the surface. If you're using the peat pucks, all you need to do is soak the pucks in preferably warm water until they fully expand, and then put the pucks into a container. The one thing I want to point out here is that once you wet the media, don't allow it to dry. That's important from the standpoint of keeping the seeds from drying, or the plants from drying out. So the next step is to plant the seeds into the media, into pots. One thing that you probably want to do is read the packet instructions. Useful, sometimes vague, but in general, you don't want to put the seeds too deep. Planting them too deep, they won't have enough strength perhaps to come and reach the surface. The general rule of thumb that I use is I plant the seeds about 3 times as deep as the sides of the seed. Small seeds, pretty much on the surface. Larger seeds go down a little deeper, 3 times the size of the seed. The next important element for growing the plants is air. All seeds and plants require oxygen. In general, however, you don't really need to use any external ventilation like a fan for either the seeds or the plants. Um, just make sure that the soil is not too soggy, because if you think about air, air has to reach the roots. And if you put too much water in the soil, it's really cutting off the oxygen to the roots, and it will kill them if sustained a period of time. So, but generally, if this after the seedlings emerge, uh, you don't really need to circulate. But you can use a fan, and a fan, if you care, will gently move the plants and exercise their stems. Um, it actually strengthens them. One thing that I often do instead of a fan is I rub my arm across the top of the seedlings uh, every time I check them, and this really stimulates the stem to be a little stronger. So the next element is the proper soil temperature. Now here's where we start getting into expense and equipment. Every seed has its own optimum germinating temperature. So you want to pick, you want to sustain that temperature during the germination process. And so what I've done is I've made some homemade equipment that uses incandescent light bulbs. You can go out and buy a seed starting mats, and they kind of regulate the temperature, and you put your containers on the mat and just wait until they emerge. The bottom heating devices I found to be a lot cheaper and definitely more rugged and long living than the seed starting mats, which also are expensive. And it's the simple thing that I made is just a box, a frame with wood, a glass top, and just aluminum wrapping around the edge with the light bulbs. And I literally manually control the light by unscrewing the bulb and screwing it in. If it's a cold night, you might need both bulbs. If it's a warm period, you may need none. But you just check the temperature, and I have a temperature temperature device on the top to look at the temperature, and I try to maintain it around 70 to 75 degrees. Put the container on just the top of the glass. Once the seeds germinate, you don't need this little device anymore. Just move them directly under the lights, and then you can start the next group of seeds. And I kind of organize my seeds by how quickly they germinate. Like pepper seeds, I always put in before tomato seeds. Tomato seeds germinate very quickly. So, and I just kind of order what I put it on the bottom heat. The next element of importance to getting a garden and seeds germinated is that they need light once they germinate. In some cases, very special, some seeds need light to germinate. That's generally not the case for most vegetable seeds, but you can check the packet. I think if that requirement is there, they would probably mention on the packet, or you go do the search on the internet to see if that's needed. But a very few seeds require light. Most will germinate in the dark, and it makes it easy. If the seeds do require light, what you'll do is just sow the seeds on the surface. These are more typical of herbs, by the way, small seeded plants. In the lighting category, I can't emphasize too much that light is very, very important once the seedlings emerge. It's almost impossible to give them too much light. Many people make the mistake of putting their containers once the seeds have germinated on a windowsill. Well, it's just generally not enough light. And you'll see what happens is the seeds in this picture shows it. The seedlings will tend to lean one way toward the light. They get spindly and they're basically weak. So artificial light, if you start anything inside, high intensity artificial light is really important. And in the very beginning, when the seedlings just emerge, you can put those lights just right above the seedlings and give it as high intensity as you can get, raising the lights as the seedlings grow. So this is my setup. I've strung some lights, fluorescent lights, and now I've added LEDs to a huge light array that I have in a little container that I built, and it works very well for those first few weeks, the seedlings growing. One thing that I recommend is that you put a timer on the lights. You don't need 24 hours. In fact, that's not an optimum. It's probably much better to use a shorter number, like 16 hours a day. I think I did the 24 hours many years, and yeah, there were times when things just didn't grow. I think basically, I'm not an expert here, but I think plants need a rest period. 24 hours is not an optimum. Now, with the development of LEDs, man, the choices are great to get a good mix of wavelengths, reds to blues, and that will be much better for the overall growth of plants, and better match the sunlight wavelengths. And LEDs are really nice too because they are cheap to operate compared to fluorescent bulbs, and I think they tend to be more long-lived. So you can get some pretty good lights in low maintenance, low operating costs with the LEDs. And we talked early on about these special conditions that some plants may need. Generally, most of the seeds you buy or plant in the garden don't require anything really special. Some plants I mentioned need light to germinate. Some have seed coatings that are very thick. Gourd seeds are a good example. They just don't want to germinate. And to encourage them, you could try scarifying. And what that means is either clip a little piece of the seed coating to allow water in, or scraping the seed on a file to thin the coating so that it allows water to penetrate into the embryo. There are other methods that may be required. Some seeds may require to be kept in cold storage. I mean, about daffodils and tulips. You have to store them in cooler temperatures for so long. Well, some seeds are like that too, but very few again. And that's storing them in a refrigerator is called cold stratification, and it satisfies the cold dormancy period that those seeds might require. But you will not need to do these with most seeds. I mention this only in passing so that you know that some seeds do require this. And if you go out, you can find some sources for which types of seeds require what. And I reference this Durr's Manual of Woody Landscape Plants that tells you a little bit about some of these types of treatments. Proper timing. That's probably another key factor in succeeding or not in planting. You want to plant your seeds so that the time it takes for them to germinate for them to grow large enough to be put outside, and then for you to harden off those plants before you put them in the garden, so that when you're ready to put them in the garden soil temperature is ideal for the plant to be put out. So, you can use these simple charts, and you can find these various places based on your growing zone. So, for example, on the right side of this, you'll see, you can plant beans for zone 7 at the end of March, early April. And you can plant beets much sooner, early March. Now, it doesn't, this certainly varies from growing zone to growing zone, and maybe you may be in a microclimate too that may change this may not be totally applicable. You can learn from year to year what that would be based on your own experience, but you can go a little bit more sophisticated if you want by just using this basic little formula. So the ideal planting date for the seeds indoors would be the last frost date. Subtract away from that the days it takes to germinate. Subtract from that the days for the seedling to grow, and then subtract again the number of days that it may take to harden off. That's about a week or so. So that's a more sophisticated way. Now, there's even further improvement. I'm going to skip here one. You can go to a website like Johnny Seed starting website. Johnny Seed has a starting calculator, and it's kind of handy because you put into the calculator the last frost date expected for your garden, and it varies a little bit from site to site. And you can go look on the internet, try to find what the last frost date is for your particular area. And that usually goes by, you can even find the city in the county to find that date. And you can then go to this Johnny Seeds calculator, and it will actually calculate for you, for the plants that has in its calculator, when to plant. And it's kind of cool. I think it's very useful, and I recommend using it. Now, this may not be the only site that has this calculator, but it's a handy calculator because it tells you when to plant seeds. For example, basil, you can start them at the 16th of March for zone 7 for this frost date. Cabbage, that probably should be done outside anyways. Let's see, eggplant, 24th of February. So that gets you a plant, hopefully, ready to be put in the ground at the proper time when the soil has warmed to the proper condition. So very handy. I recommend you looking into it and using it if you feel it has, value to you. I've just put some other, the seed starting calculator had quite a few plants on it, so I put a number of those plants. It's quite a few. So now we have our seeds. They're germinated. They've been sitting under we put them under the lights. And the next question is, well, do we want to fertilize them? Or how much fertilizer to put on them? The fertilizer, the mixes that are in the soil might have some fertilizer in there. But if you see that the plants are yellowing, you can try to, you do what I do is I mix a weak mix of the liquid fertilizer after they have emerged. And I would recommend that you not put too much. So I water it down, because too much fertilizer will actually encourage algae and other diseases. So use it sparingly. But it may be something that you might want to use if you see yellowing of the plants. This next slide kind of captures the big picture planning and organizing. You know, it takes a lot of organizing to grow a garden. You want to buy the seeds. You build whatever you need to start the seeds. You plant them indoors. You want to plant them at the proper time. You want to care for the seedlings, and record keeping. One point I make on the record keeping is not just keeping records in a notebook, but making sure you have plant labels and use them, because this is often one of my downfalls is the plant labels get mixed up or I forget to put them on. I'll say, oh, I'll do that tomorrow. And then I don't know what the plant is or the variety of the plant is. I might know it's a pepper, but maybe not a sweet pepper versus a hot pepper. So now we've gotten the seedlings started indoors. We have labels on everything, but we want to continue growing them. The seedlings are in their original containers. You want to pot them up, transplant them. Typically, I repot after the first set of true leaves has grown. And a true leaf is a different shape than the first leaf that comes out of a seedling. The first leaves are typically just a pair of leaves. But as they grow like a tomato, you'll see that the second set of leaves looks like a tomato leaf. And putting them into bigger pots will allow them to expand their roots. And I put them into individual pots so that they don't become entwined with each other. And it basically is better at that point when you put them in these pots, separate pots, to put them in the garden, because then you have a little pot by itself and you just put it in the spot you want to put it. The seedlings can be placed in potting soil. Now, at this point, the soil that I mix, remember early on I said you want a sterile soil, but at this point when you pot up, I use whatever I have, what I call potting soil. It's not sterile. Often I mix in, because I have worms, compost in the house. I mix in dried worm compost in with the potting soil, and then put the seedling in that mix and grow it for the remainder of the time that it's in the container. I mentioned that after the first true leaves come out, and this picture shows the difference between the true leaves and the first leaves that come out of a seedling. They're very different in shape. There's no exact time to replant. I'm often pretty lazy and say, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. And they get more than a few true leaves. But once I repot them, that's when I become a little bit more aggressive on fertilizing them. Now we have our plants. They've been growing inside under lights in the larger pots. It's getting time to take them outside. They're getting too big for the growing area under lights. You want to bring them outside. And that period of time is what's known as a hardening off period. It's a time where you're gradually exposing the seedlings now to sunlight. Sunlight is much more intense than the grow lights you've used indoors. So they can't be given direct sunlight for very long periods. It's best to place them early on in a semi-shaded area where they get only a very minimal sun. And then as time goes, more and more sun. So you want to be able to be portable to move the plant trays with the repots, potted seedlings more and more into the sun as they get a little older. And it takes about 7 to 10 days to get them used to the sunshine. Obviously, don't want to put them out too soon before frost is ended. But if you time it right, you'll get your seedlings out and they'll be hardened off when it's time to put them in the garden itself. Um, After the hardening period is completed, um, the plant should be large enough, and I typically use a rule of thumb about 3 inches or taller and healthy to be put in the garden. Frost should be, the last threat of frost should be very small or past, um, and when the soil is warm enough for that crop. Uh, at this point, you should have already prepared your garden. Whatever you do, till it and plant it. Placing the plants in the proper place in the garden is very important. Um, you don't want to put plants that are tall in front of plants that are behind plants that are very short. And in theory, especially if it's the first year, you should have your soil tested for nutritional content and maybe amended it as recommended by the agricultural agent. Um, and in my case, I have a hilly terrain, so I terrace. And so I do all this in advance of putting the seedlings out. And I have till rows to keep the water in channels so it doesn't erode excessive amounts. So, you want to have all this done before the plants are put out there. And spacing the plants adequately so they have enough air circulation, which is important for disease control and sunshine. And then you want to have your garden ready with irrigation equipment. If you, and I typically use plastic PVC with holes punched in them. But whatever you use, you want to have that all ready, because once the plants are in, it's hard to put that in without damaging the plants. And a factor that also should be used in placing the plants in the garden is rotating the crops. If at all possible, try to not plant the same kind of plant in the same area year after year. And it really will help you in the long range to avoid diseases. One thing, I guess the next thing that I want to cover here is troubleshooting. There's a number of things that can go wrong. And early on, one of the things that more often people mention is a damping off. And it's a disease, it's a fungal or condition. And it weakens the plants at where they emerge from the ground, from the soil. And it's more prevalent in cool and wet. And you can avoid it to some extent by using quality seeds, because the seeds can actually have fungus on their coatings. Try to use sterile media. That was my emphasis early. Sterile tools, sterile containers. And if necessary, you can use fungicides to avoid or to try to treatment. With fungal diseases, it's a fungal, using a fungicide, it's too late to help. But if you've seen this in the past, you can preempt it by using the fungicides on the seedlings as they emerge. Just try to avoid overwet and overcrowding. Another condition, and I often see this, is algae. Algae doesn't directly harm the seedlings, but it does compete, and it forms a thick mat on the top of the surface of the soil, and it can actually cause rotting of the plant stems. So if it does form, what I typically do is break it up manually, because you just take a pencil tip or whatever and just move it and break up the algae so it's not touching the plant stem, and also so that it doesn't have a lot of contact with the soil below it. Another thing you can do to avoid the algae is to bottom water. So if the plants are sitting in trays, you can water from the bottom, not the top. This keeps the top surface drier. And if you do get some algae, you can actually sprinkle fine dust of the media to cover the surface, and it will help reduce the light striking the algae so it would inhibit its growth. One thing that often happens or can happen is that you forget about watering the plants for too long and they get dried out. Well, it's pretty bad. And if they really dry badly, you can't recover them. The conditions, they'll wilt. They'll show, just completely wilted plants. And if that occurs, you want to water them immediately, and basically try to recover the plant. It may or may not work. But good luck. So try to keep them. Avoid the condition of overly dry. Using a warm water might help a little bit, by the way, to re-wet the media quickly instead of using cold water. Another issue is that you often see, and I encounter this every once in a while, is not allowing enough time to harden off. If you try to rush hardening off process, the plants might get sunburned or just wilted because they dried out too quickly. And you just try to save as many plants as you can by moving the plants to a shady area. You've invested a lot of time at this point, so you don't want to rush the hardening off period. And then we have the insect problems. Insects are generally not a problem if you start your plants inside. But you might see it, especially if you're in the hardening off period, you might see aphids, and they will be attracted to this new growth, and they will damage the plants by sucking the fluids from them. There's a couple of ways of treating this. You can hand pick them. You can try to wash them off. You can kill them by spraying with insecticidal soap or even insecticide. You want to save those plants. You've invested a lot of time. So at this point, I'm pretty much completed the presentation, but I want to mention a couple of references that I'll make. In preparing the presentation, I used UGA Bulletin 1432. I recommend you go to that bulletin, read it. You'll find the same type of material that I've presented, but you can go back and reference it easier. And also, Johnny's selected the Select Seed Company seed calculator I show here as a reference used. Well, that concludes my presentation, and I'm opening up the presentation to questions at this point. Josh?
Thank you, Mike. Great job. I don't see any questions here in the chat reel. So I think you did a great job covering it end to end. One thing that I was going to add in that hardening off period, I think where I've run into some problems and challenges in the past is tending to be more focused on that sun exposure and the plants being more dried out because they're in such a sheltered environment, and even if we put them in a shady spot around the house, that there's just a whole lot more air movement outdoors than there is indoors, and these plants can dry out really quickly even when we may not think it's an overly windy day. So really paying attention to they're going to need a lot more water just to stay upright and stay hydrated when we do that hardening off. We've got a question here. You mentioned it's important to store seed properly. How do you store yours?
Well, that's a really good question. I think most seed packets have more seeds than you could ever plant in a given season. And what I do is I try to, I organize it. I try to put the seeds in a number one, dry environment. So I'll take the seed packets, I'll seal them individually so that the seeds don't leak from the packets. I'll use a piece of tape, and I'll put those packets in organized by group, like all my tomato seeds, and I grow a variety of tomatoes. I'll put them in a single Ziploc container and squeeze the air out of it. I'll do this with peppers and other things. And then I'll take all of those seeds and put them in a container. And I use the old popcorn container. Remember the metal containers we got with popcorn? I don't know if they're still selling now, but they're metal containers. And I put those seed packets in those containers. And so that's going to be, and I put them in my basement. So I maintain dry, cool in the basement, and dark in the container, and keep them. And I keep them for very long periods. I've kept seed packets for over 5 years. And, if I feel like the germination rate's low, I'll test them. But it's been a pretty good success story for me. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, well,
Any other questions? I'm sure either I bored everybody to death today, or they really got it, and we're good. I had
I
some
think you did a
others.
great job covering it from, front to back. So, let's see, we got one here. LED lights, if there is info at the garden center.
Okay, I talk a little bit about LEDs. If you go into LEDs, the lighting section in a big box store, they'll tell you what the Kelvin wavelength are. Some of them will be soft white, some of them will be blue or bluish. The higher the Kelvin number, the bluer the light. So if you're going to set up a light box for seedlings, what you might want to do is buy some that have lower Kelvin wavelengths and some that have higher ones. And so you'll get a mix of spectra in the light box, which will be healthier for the plant's growth in the big picture. So LEDs are very fantastic, if you ask me, for putting them into a light box, because they can give you that spectral variation. Now you can buy special lights much more expensively, but that have a wide spectrum, and you can buy them. They're grow lights, and you can buy fluorescent grow lights, and you can buy LED grow lights. But you can do it yourself if you want to save a few dollars, but you'll have to mix and match the LED wavelengths. I hope that helps.
All right, and we've got a question here from Susan. It may be a little bit of a loaded question, but what is your favorite kind of tomato?
Oh, if it's my friend Susan, longtime friend, she is my mentor. So I learned from the very beginning. And I'll tell you, my favorite tomato is Totally Tomatoes makes a tomato. It's a yellow jelly bean. Absolutely the best tomato ever. It's sweet as sugar. It produces all summer, and you just can't get enough of them. They produce incredible quantities. I give them away to the neighbors, to the point that they actually shutter their windows and lock their doors when they see me walking by with a bag. So, but that's my best. That's tomatoes, these jelly bean tomatoes. Wow.
I thought you were going to give the classic answer, which is usually the last one that I just ate.
Well, no, I do have my favorites when it comes to tomatoes.
And then the question here, which I can help with, Lou's asking a recommended local source for seeds. So, there are the kind of your Ace Hardwares and feed and seed stores that especially if you want to have a big garden, they tend to sell a more narrowed down variety, but you can buy, scoop or seeds by the scoop, usually a lot cheaper than the per packet price. So local sources, that would be one. The Master Gardeners, in normal times, we have a few seed libraries where we will have seeds that have been donated, some that are shared, and we normally we'll package those up in the wintertime and then restock those libraries for spring planting season. Libraries have had kind of open public hours in the last few months, so I don't know if we're going to actually get those out this year.
Replant library.
But that has been a source of local seeds locally, and then just I think having more gardener friends that save their own seeds is always a great way to get seeds that we know work in our own backyards. So, Mike, do you have any other suggestions on that?
Well, I think your suggestion, one of the things that I do, I go to the local feed and seed store and buy corn seeds. They have, about half a dozen varieties, and I like to buy my seeds from them because some of the varieties that they've had have been just delicious. I mean, absolutely delicious. Now, again, they don't have as much variety and may not have all the kinds of seeds that you want, but for something like corn, that is kind of their area of specialty, a feed and seed store. That's my go-to place for that. So it depends on what it is. Specialized seeds, special varieties of tomatoes or peppers, you're going to have to go online or go to a big box store that has a large selection to get those kinds of things. But everybody has their favorites, and I try to grow my favorites year after year, and always do a little experimenting to it on the side for some of the plants.
All right, well, everyone, if there's no more questions, I will get this recording put up, maybe by Monday. So if you want to go back and refer it, or send it to a friend that wasn't able to join us, so I'll email all of you, and then I'll also send a really quick survey, like 2 questions. Just let us know any comments, feedback on today, and suggestions for future programs. So thank you for joining us, and stay tuned till next month when we're going to talk pruning ornamental shrubs in the landscape.
Well, also, Josh, I want to thank everyone for joining us, especially friends. I think a very warm friend, longtime friend, Sue, has joined me. She was who I first learned the joy of gardening from. Farmer's Gardener, best source you could ever learn gardening from. And I think my daughter was also on this, so I was very pleased. Of course, all my gardening friends, I hope I helped, and I appreciate the opportunity to have made this presentation.